I usually start with some thank yous, but thank you just seems grossly inadequate for Mara Brick and Bonnie Young and Taub. They have brought their passion for books and their attention to detail to selecting awesome authors and ensuring the success of our literary club. And every year I say they could never top this lineup. And what do you know, they do. So even though I frequently thank you, it's never enough, it's inadequate. I am very, very grateful. You remind people to come, you make sure we get the registration lists, you pay attention to everything, and I really appreciate it. But most of all, you collaborate with Rabbi Sue to select awesome authors. I've loved everything we've read. Today's book is no exception. So I don't want to talk too much. I want to make sure we leave as much time as possible for the author and Sue to chat about the book. So thank you all for joining us. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Lori. I'm delighted to see everybody. It was nice to hear about people's Thanksgiving weeks, breaks, time together as family, and know that I am so very grateful for all of you and this opportunity to be together as we do so often. And again, thank you to Bonnie and Mara for being such wonderful partners and in helping to select really wonderful books. And even better than the books are the authors behind the books. And that's been such a wonderful, delightful aspect of what I've been able to do as liaison both to the Jewish Book Council, but also with our Women of Washington Hebrew. It was so nice to be in person at the boutique and to see the way you all just brought everyone in our community and beyond back together. People were so happy to be there, and being able to now see some of you whom we might not see as often or as frequently, but being here together, even on screen, is just as wonderful. And so thank you to everyone for joining us today. I want to, before I introduce our author, I just want to give a quick shout out to the Jewish Book Council, with whom we partner. And that's when Lori talks about Bonnie and Mara and finding wonderful authors, we attend this conference every spring. It's been virtual the last few years, but we get literally 2 minutes and a little bit of information, and we go with our gut. And then after being able to fully read the books, it's always wonderful to know that we have our instincts have led us in the right direction. And today is certainly an example of that. And then the opportunity to connect and learn from these wonderful authors. And so I want to, before we get started, I want to remind everyone that today's in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. And to that end, we encourage you, if you have not yet read today's book, to do so. And you can purchase it through our WHC Mitzvah Mall, which I've just put the link into the chat. You can also, I always encourage people to go and to that. The Mitzvah Mall supports wonderful ongoing work that Washington Hebrew Congregation does in the community. Certainly many of the projects of our Women of Washington Hebrew Congregation. We also like to support our local booksellers as well. So I encourage you, whichever works best for you, if you're able to support a local bookseller wherever you might be, we encourage you to do that and to order through them or to go in. So today's book, Maybe It's Me on Being the Wrong Kind of Woman, is our book for today, but even better is our author, Eileen Pollack. Hold on. Grew up in Liberty, New York, in the heart of the Jewish Catskills, where her grandparents operated a small hotel. I'm sure we're going to have some conversations, as we already began, about the Jewish Catskills, very familiar to everyone here. And certainly we could start naming hotels as we were earlier before we got started, and we'll look forward to continuing to share. Eileen was one of the first 2 women to graduate from Yale with a BS in physics and later earned an MFA from the Iowa Writers' Workshop. She is the author of the novels The Professor of Immortality, The Bible of Dirty Jokes, A Perfect Life, and Breaking and Entering, which was named a New York Times Editor's Choice selection, as well as 2 collections of short fiction, The Rabbi in the Attic, which she and I were talking about earlier, and I'm definitely going to be following up on that, and In the Mouth, which won the Edward Lewis Walland Award for Jewish Fiction. Eileen's work of creative nonfiction, Woman Walking Ahead in Search of Catherine Weldon and Sitting Bull, was made into a movie starring Jessica Chastain. Her investigative memoir, The Only Woman in the Room, Why Science is Still a Boys' Club, was published in 2015. A long excerpt appeared in the New York Times Sunday magazine and went viral. Her work has been selected for Best American Short Stories, Best American Essays, and Best American Travel Writing. Her most recent book, an essay collection, which I just showed you, called Maybe It's Me on Being the Wrong Kind of Woman, was published in 2022 by Delphinium Books and received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Kirkus, as well as a rave from the Jewish Forward. A former director of the MFA program at the University of Michigan, Eileen now lives and writes in Boston. We are so excited that you are here to share with us. And I don't know, hopefully others have read as well, and it's okay if you haven't, but really entertaining, and I'm looking forward to both what you're going to share with us and then some of the questions that it will inspire as well. So thank you, Eileen, so much for your time and for being here with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Sue. That's wonderful, and it's just lovely to be here. I have to say, I hope you all had as nice a Thanksgiving as I did. My son and daughter-in-law came in from Chicago, so there were 3 of us in my little 1-bedroom apartment, and I just took them to the airport this morning, so now it feels really empty, bigger, but meeting with you is helping me keep away those blues, when your kids go back, and you're also helping me forestall the moment I have to start doing the laundry, so thank you. Very nice to be here. Just a little bit about the title of this book, Maybe It's Me. I've always felt that, either the whole world was crazy or maybe it was me and I couldn't decide. And I think many of you, more of us lately, I think have that feeling that, that either the whole world is crazy or we are. And I think we realize now it's probably the rest of the world. That subtitle, on being the wrong kind of woman, it's hard. I wrote these essays over many, many years and not with a mind to have them in a collection. So when you come to put them together and have one title, it doesn't necessarily fit every essay in the book. But I think most of the essays are some form of me feeling like the wrong kind of little girl, wrong kind of woman, wrong kind of daughter, mother, sister, Jew, American. So that's kind of where the title comes from. The first essay in the book, Pigeons, which is why there's a pigeon on the cover of the book, I'm going to read you most of that, at least half of that essay, which is me as a little girl first realizing that I don't see the world the way the adults see it. And I'm glad I don't have to explain to you what it meant, that this is taking place in the Catskills, and who the comedians Buddy Hackett and Don Rickles are. So thankfully I don't have to explain that. So can everybody hear me? Is this all coming through? Great. Okay. So this is Pigeons. Not long ago, I went back to my elementary school, a Gothic brick and mortar fortress whose Escher-like stairs dead-end on floors that lie halfway between other floors and whose halls branch off into mysterious tunnels that suddenly disgorge a student into the cafeteria or the girls' locker room or the balcony of benches overlooking the auditorium that doubles as the gym. I wasn't surprised to find my younger self crying at the back of this or that classroom or staring up at some adult whose behavior baffled me, or wandering the gloomy stairwells, wondering if I would ever find my way to a sunnier, less confusing, less confining life outside. What startled me was how often I glimpsed the ghosts of classmates whose existences I had forgotten. The ones whose lives, even then, must have been far more troubled than my own, and who, even though there were fewer than 100 students in my class, disappeared from my consciousness long before the rest of us had moved on to high school, let alone college. Seeing those ghostly classmates, I wanted to bend down and comfort them, as I had comforted my own younger self. I wanted to assure them everything would be all right, but I felt the way a doctor must feel approaching a patient who was waiting for a pathology report the doctor knows contains nothing but devastating news. My own malady wasn't fatal, although it felt so at the time. The symptoms started in 3rd grade, the day a stranger appeared at our classroom door and summoned me to the hall. My classmates and I had been making cardboard headbands on which to glue the feathers we had won for good behavior. A good Indian was defined by her ability to walk to the bathroom without speaking to her partner or digging her fingers into his spine. That was the year we discovered how vulnerable the human body is. Twist a thumb between 2 vertebrae and watch your victim writhe. Place the tip of your shoe at the back of his rigid knee and effect complete collapse. The edges of my headband kept sticking to my fingers. Not that I had any feathers to paste on the headband anyway. "This is Mr. Spiro, the school psychologist," my teacher said. "He wants to talk to you in his office." Then she went back in and shut the door. I had been causing a lot of trouble. The year before, my teacher had joked she was going to bring in her dirty laundry to keep me occupied. In reality, Mrs. Hoos had the sense to let me do whatever I wanted as long as I didn't disturb my neighbors. At the start of each day, I stowed a dozen books beneath my seat and read them one by one, looking up to see if she was teaching us something new, which she rarely was. I still love Gertrude Hoos, who was as lumpy and soft as the bag of dirty laundry I gladly would have washed if only she had brought it in. But my 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Neff, was made of starchier, sterner stuff. By God, if we were reading aloud, paragraph by painful paragraph, I was going to sit there with my book open to the appropriate page and not read a single word ahead. If we were learning to add, I would sit there and learn to add, even if I already had learned that skill by keeping score when my grandmother and I played gin rummy at home. Mrs. Neff gave me a workbook in which I could teach myself to multiply, but working in that workbook was a privilege, she said, not a right. The more bored I grew, the more I misbehaved, for which I lost the privilege of working in my workbook. Multiplication began to seem like a meal I would never get to eat because I was too exhausted by my hunger to reach the plate. This continued until Mrs. Neff and I each wished the other gone. And since she was the teacher, she had the power to make her wish come true. Warily, I followed Mr. Spiro to the 3rd floor of our building and then down the main hall, where we entered a narrow door, traversed a short dark passage, and climbed a few more steps. The room was oddly shaped, with low slanted ceilings that met at a peak on top. We were in the belfry, I thought. You could see it from the playground, where the older kids frightened us with stories about the vampires who lived inside. There was an open window along one wall, but the office was so hot I could barely breathe. Mr. Spiro settled behind the desk and motioned me to sit in a chair beside him. Bushy black curls exploded from his head like the lines a cartoonist draws to indicate a character is confused or drunk. Mr. Spiral, I remember thinking, which is how 4 decades later, 5 now, I can still recall his name. His heavy brows, gigantic nose, and thickly thatched mustache seemed connected to his glasses, like those disguises you could buy at Woolworth's. His suit was white, with thin red stripes, like the boxes movie popcorn came in, and he wore a bright red bow tie. This was 1964. I had never seen a man in a shirt that wasn't white, or a suit that wasn't dark, or a tie that called attention to itself. And I felt the thrill and dread any child would feel at being selected from the audience by a clown. He must have sensed I distrusted him. "Would you like some Oreos?" he asked, then slid a packet across the desk. I can still see those cookies, so chocolatey rich and round, the red thread around their cellophane cocoon just waiting to be unzipped. But a voice in my head warned me to be careful. It was as if the clown had motioned me to sniff the bright pink carnation fastened to his lapel. "How do I know those cookies aren't poisoned?" I asked. The bushy black brows shot up. "Do you really think I would poison you?" "Well," I said, "you're a stranger. How do I know you wouldn't?" I don't remember what happened next. He probably reassured me the Oreos were fit to eat. I don't remember if I ate them. All I know is he changed the subject. In a falsely jolly tone, he said, "So, I hear you want to be an authoress." If he had asked if I wanted to be an author, I might have told him yes. But I had never heard that word, authoress, and it seemed as dangerous as a snake. Authoress, it hissed, like otherness or adulteress, a word I had encountered in a novel and didn't quite understand except to know I didn't want to be one. "Who told you that?" I demanded. "Why, your teacher, Mrs. Neff." "That's because she doesn't like me," I said. "She probably told you a lot of other lies, but those aren't true either." He began scribbling on a pad, and even a child of 8 knows anything a school psychologist writes about you on a pad can't do you any good. Outside on the ledge, a pair of plump gray pigeons bobbled back and forth like seedy vaudeville comics. This was the Catskills after all. Pigeon variations of Don Rickles and Buddy Hackett, who sidestepped toward each other, traded a dirty joke, bumped shoulders in raunchy glee, and shuffled back across the stage. "Well then," he finished writing, "I hear you're a very bright little girl, and I would like you to take some tests that are designed to show if you're smart enough to skip a grade." Tests, I thought? What kind of tests? Who suggested I skip a grade? Then it came to me. Mrs. Neff. If she couldn't get rid of me any other way, she would skip me a year ahead. I would miss Harry and Eric, the boys I couldn't resist jabbing in the spine as we walked down the hall, but 4th grade had to be less boring than 3rd. Bring on the tests, I thought, expecting a mimeograph sheet of addition and subtraction problems or some paragraphs to read aloud. Mr. Spiro brought out a flip book. He showed me drawing after drawing, asking me to describe what was missing from each. But how could a person know what was missing from a picture if there was nothing to compare it to? Did every house have a chimney? Was the daisy missing a petal, or had someone merely plucked it? After we finished with the flip book, Mr. Spiro brought out a board fitted with colored shapes. He would flash a pattern on a card and ask me to reproduce it. As I recall, he timed me. But as vivid as my memory is for people and events, I have a terrible time remembering patterns and facts. Had the purple triangle been above or below the line? Had the rectangle been blue or green? And who had decreed that playing with colored shapes should determine if a child was ready to skip a grade? It wasn't enough to be smart. You needed to be smart in the way grown-ups wanted you to be smart. Finally, Mr. Spiro presented me with a test like the ones I was used to taking. If you want to buy 3 pencils, he said, and 1 pencil costs 4 cents, how much would it cost you to buy all 3? I was about to add 3 and 4 when I realized this required a different kind of math. I could have figured out the answer by adding 4 3 times, but something about being so bored that I'd misbehaved, which had denied me the chance to work in my workbook, which had denied me the chance to learn to multiply, which seemed to be preventing me from going on to 4th grade where I might be less bored and less tempted to misbehave, made me cry out, "This isn't fair." But when Mr. Spiro asked me what wasn't fair, I couldn't put my grievance into words. We sat in silent stalemate until a pigeon flew in the room. It flapped around our heads and beat its wings against the walls. But this struck me as no stranger than anything else that had happened in that room. For all I knew, Mr. Spiro had trained the pigeon to fly in on cue, test some aspect of my psychology I would need to pass 4th grade. The safest response, I decided, was no response at all. Mr. Spiro, on the other hand, leapt up on his desk and started waving his arms and shouting. Imagine sitting in a chair looking up at a full-grown man in a red and white striped suit who was standing on his desk flailing at a pigeon. I might have understood if he had been flailing at a bee, but what harm could a pigeon do? At last, the bird found a crevice at the very top of the belfry and disappeared inside. My final glimpse of its bobbing rear end is the image I still see whenever I hear the word pigeonholed. Mr. Spiro smoothed his suit, climbed down from his desk, and asked why I hadn't been more upset. Hadn't I noticed a pigeon in the room? All these years later, I remember what I said. Why should I be upset? This isn't my office. I don't have to clean up after it. Then I remembered nothing more until a disheveled Mr. Spiro led me back to class. Later, he told my mother I wasn't emotionally ready to skip a grade. The experience left me more resentful than ever. I misbehaved more and more. The following year, my teacher grew so impatient with my incessant chattering that in front of everyone, she said, "Eileen, has anyone ever told you how obnoxious you are?" Obnoxious, I repeated, appalled and delighted by the toxicity of the word. Obnoxious, was I? Fine. I shunned the company of the other girls and hung around with the roughest boys who were even more obnoxious than I was. I still did well on tests. What was I supposed to do? Pretend I didn't know how to add or multiply? But I refused to act the part of the well-mannered little lady the grown-ups wanted me to play. I looked for Mr. Spiro, but I never saw the man again. I searched in vain for his secret office. From the outside on the playground, I could look up and see the belfry, but the windows were boarded up and the pigeons, like me, couldn't find a way to get inside. Okay, I'm not going to read the middle of the essay. I'll just summarize it. What happens is when I enter sixth grade, my classroom turns out to be right down that same corridor opposite what had been Mr. Spiro's office. I had a terrible teacher in sixth grade, a horrible man, but I couldn't get transferred out because he was friends with his parents were friends with my parents. He didn't want to be a teacher. He wanted to be a photographer. He was saving up to buy some fancy camera. And without asking the administration or anybody, he had turned Mr. Spiro's office into his own private darkroom where he developed the pictures he took on weekends. And he also used it to take some of the kids in there and beat them up. Now, he ruined my life by having me stand up repeatedly, and he would say things like, "Why can't you all be like Eileen and get A's on your exams?" Which, let me tell you, does nothing for your popularity. But I had a crush on the boy who sat across from me, Walter Rustic. He was adorable. And I think he had a crush on me. What happened was one day we were running around on the playground the way you do when you're 12 years old. And you want to think of a reason, an excuse to touch members of the opposite sex. And so Walter and I were chasing each other, and he grabbed me by my new winter coat and ripped it. He didn't mean to. I don't think I tattled on him. I hope I didn't, but somehow Mr. Fishman found out, and he punished Walter for ripping my coat by taking him into the dark room, and we could hear him beating him up. Okay, so that's the part that I didn't read. And what happened is Walter disappeared. He didn't graduate with the rest of us, and I never gave him another thought until I had actually gone back to the elementary school to do research for a different book. And when I was there, he came back to me. He was one of the ghosts that I saw there. And I asked a friend of mine whatever happened to Walter, and she knew his family, his mother and brother lived in Las Vegas near her. And I did all this detective work, and I tracked down what had happened to him. He had become mentally ill, homeless. He died a terrible death in a dumpster in Corpus Christi, Texas. So that's the part of the essay I'm leaving out. I'm just going to read you the ending. Okay. I have no doubt Walter would have ended up homeless or dead, even if he had been blessed with a more caring sixth grade teacher. I was only 12 years old. I don't hold myself responsible for the beating Walter received that day, but being thrown against a wall doesn't do anyone any good. It isn't much fun to occupy any of the circles of hell to which all but the most popular and well-adjusted students find themselves consigned. But schools fail different children in different ways. Kids like Pablo Rodriguez, I mentioned him earlier, grow up unable to read and write with no way to earn a living. Kids like Walter Rustic grow up to be dead. And kids like me, We make it through. We end up who we were meant to be. Sometimes we end up someone better. Despite Mrs. Neff's refusal to allow me to work in my workbook, despite Mr. Spiro's decision that I wasn't ready to skip a grade, despite a similar decision the following year to advance the two smartest boys while leaving me behind because, as the principal claimed, girls don't finish courses in science or math, I studied those courses on my own and got accepted to Yale, where, despite being very far behind my mostly male classmates, I graduated Phi Beta Kappa summa cum laude with a degree, an honors degree in physics. I was too angry and confused and lacking in confidence to go on to physics grad school, but I'm not sure how much I care. What gadget might I have invented? What small theorem might I have proved that would have mattered half as much as my being forced to learn compassion? I gave up the chance to spend my life multiplying and dividing so I could become an authoress and tell the stories of all those poor pigeons who didn't make it out of our school alive, who survived childhood but not adulthood, who are missing from our community. Although, how can we measure what we have lost? To what can we compare their absence? So that's the first essay in the book. I have a little bit more time before we do questions, so I'm just going to read you the beginnings of two very different essays. They're personal essays, but what I'm looking for, what I was often looking for, is the intersection between the personal and the historic, especially like my family's history and what was it connected to or what was going on at the time. So this piece is called The Jewish Shah. And I'm just very interested in family legends, where they come from, are they true? In an earlier book, I was interested in all the Black Americans who claimed they were descended from Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and that was before it was genealogically proved that they were right, they were descended from them. So this is based on my family's legend that the Shah of Iran is Jewish. The Shah of Iran is Jewish, my father would remind us whenever the newspapers ran a story about Iran, which was often in those days, the 60s and early 70s. One issue of Life magazine showed a magnificent red silk tent supporting a chandelier over a resplendent array of emperors and ambassadors dining in the desert at the Shah's celebration of 2,500 years of Persian history and 30 years of his own Pahlavi regime. My father knew the Shah was Jewish because he had been told the secret by his best friend from dental school, with whom he also had served for many years in World War II. Just don't tell anybody, my father warned. If the Shah knew we knew his secret, he would send his police to bump us off. I loved to hear that story. As far as I could tell, it was the only romantic part of my father's life. I had little respect for his profession, or the role he had served in the war, fixing the teeth of British soldiers in Calcutta, India. His best friend, Sidney Pahlavi, okay, so Pahlavi related to Iran is Pahlavi, and this guy's name was Pahlavi, Polivy. So his best friend, Sidney Pahlavi, another Jewish dentist from New York, used to joke that he and my father should slip over the border to Iran and visit the Shah, who happened to be his cousin. As Sidney told the tale, 4 of his uncle's sons had fled Russia in their teens to avoid conscription by the Tsar. The 5th cousin went east instead of west, making his way over the Caucasus Mountains to Persia. He tried to earn a living as a peddler, but eventually joined or was inducted into a troop of Cossacks. He hid his origins, became a Muslim, and rose quickly through the ranks. There was a coup, he changed his name and declared himself the Shah. At the start of World War II, he threw in with Hitler, and his brothers in America washed their hands of their black sheep relative. But seeing as how Sidney and my father were in the neighborhood, they might as well drop in. My father and his friend never made it to Iran. Victory was declared and the men were sent home. My father opened his dental practice in the Catskills and Sidney opened his in the Bronx. We drifted apart, my father said. We would correspond, but not as often. Sidney and his wife drove up to Liberty to see my parents. Then we had a falling out, my mother said. They never came back. She wasn't sure why. It bothered my father that he and his friend lost contact. We were like two brothers. He shook his head. But what can you do? The years slipped by. My father was looking forward to seeing Sydney at their 30th dental school reunion. Your mother and I had just walked in when someone ran up to me and said, your friend Sydney just died. Oh, I nearly fainted. It hit me like a ton of bricks. Telling the story about the Shah must have been a way for my father to keep his friend's memory alive. Besides, he believed the story. I wanted to believe it too. And in the fall of the year 2000, when I had time off from teaching and a grant to do some research, I decided to find out if it could be true. So the rest of the essay is me trying to figure out if it was true, but also trying to figure out who my father really was. And part of it is I tracked down Sydney Pallavi's daughter, who's sort of my age, and she knew nothing about her father because he died when she was young, and the mother was kind of mentally ill and wouldn't let anybody talk about the father. And so it's the story about not only finding out if the Shah of Iran was really Jewish or not, but who my father really was, this girl finding out who her father, Sydney, really was. And I'm just always, a lot of my short stories and novels too are about parents and children, how we don't really know who our parents are. We think we do, but they have secrets, and we think we know our children, but we don't really know so much about them. So I dropped my book on the floor. I'm going to pick it up. And I'm just going to read you the opening of the title essay, Maybe It's Me, which is called The One Woman Show I'll Never Perform in Public. Okay. It's a little risque, but I asked the rabbi. She said it was okay.
I thought everyone here could handle it.
You're all grown up. I turned 60, I moved to New York. People said, why would you move to New York? The streets there are smeared with dog shit, with people shit. It's so hot in the subway, your blood bubbles in your veins. The train you want is never coming. For the price of a bedbug-infested shoebox in Manhattan, you could afford an entire house in the nicest neighborhood in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is exactly what I traded for my lousy shoebox in Manhattan. I told everyone, I love the theater, I love ballet, opera, great restaurants, world-class museums. The truth is, I wanted to find true love before I died. You think just because a woman is in her 60s, she loses her interest in sex and romance? You think desire's like a battery, it just runs down? A good-looking man walks by and you don't feel that flutter in your vagina? When you're young and no one has ever done a really good job of making you feel so beautiful, even your tiniest toe is worthy as of being sucked on, then sure, you're dying for a man to take you in his arms and kiss you. If you have only ever seen people eating chocolate on TV, you wonder what chocolate tastes like. But after 40 years enjoying everything from Reese's peanut butter cups to the finest, darkest Scharfenberger burger truffles, are you going to say, nah, I don't care if I ever taste chocolate again? Not so much as an M&M. When you're a kid, you assume women in their 60s should be content to sit around playing mahjong or canasta or whatever games old ladies play. Just shut up and go play canasta. Put on your tracksuit and your old lady shoes and go for a walk around the mall with your other old lady friends. If a woman in her 60s is looking for a man, that might be cute. But if she complains no one wants to date her, hey, you ought to be glad you're not tied to a wheelchair drooling on your pajamas. When you're young, you don't understand that old people feel exactly the same as you. It's still me in here. Someone zipped me inside this old lady suit and I can't get out. Maybe you're a little wiser, but all that means is you're less willing to settle for the bullshit you settled for as a kid. I do not need a man to complete me. The last time I looked, I wasn't missing any parts. Most of the time, I'm happier to be alone. It's just if you only get touched when some drunk on the subway presses up against you, you come down with an emotional flu. You know how everybody says healthcare isn't a privilege, it's a right? Well, it ought to be a right to have someone who can hug you once a month. Someone you can compare notes with after you see a movie. Someone you can go shopping with so you don't need to lug home all the bottles and cans and jars. Someone who will make the salad while you make the pasta. And really, shouldn't everyone be guaranteed a special someone who is obliged to drive them home after a colonoscopy? I don't need a man to fertilize my eggs. I am not a science fair project. I already have a son. My biological clock is not ticking. You know the hourglass in The Wizard of Oz? That's the timepiece we're talking about here. I get to spend however many years I have left on this planet, locked in the witch's tower with only Toto to keep me company. And when the sand runs out, the witch flies back with her monkey men and uses her giant axe to lop off my head. Here's what it's like to be in your 60s. You lie in bed wondering if anyone will ever see your breasts again. Touch them, kiss them, appreciate how smooth they still are, how soft. It's like buying a big bag of oranges and you aren't sure you can eat them fast enough before they wither and attract the fruit flies. So I moved to New York because if you live in a college town in the Midwest, you're going to run through the eligible men very quickly, at least the ones who aren't your students or your therapist or your best friend's ex-husbands, who aren't any worse than other men, except you already know they never empty the dishwasher and occasionally sleep with prostitutes. Also, I thought men in New York might not find me as intimidating as men in the rest of the country find me. I am only 5'3". I weigh 125 pounds. But when I was young, I made the tragic mistake of earning a degree in physics. And apparently that makes a woman as undateable as the Incredible Hulk. Men are afraid they will be sucking on a nipple and the woman will whisper, the sum of the square of the legs of a right triangle equals the square of the hypotenuse. Also, I have published a lot of books, and men worry I will write about how small their penises are or how they aren't any good at giving head, which I would never do unless they treated me in such a way as to justify such a comment. The men in New York say they are looking for a woman who is funny and smart, except what they really want is a woman who is smart enough to appreciate how smart they are, a woman who will laugh at their jokes, even if the jokes are racist, sexist, or not the least bit funny. I understand why men my age want younger women. I wouldn't mind having sex with a younger man. But women in their 60s have been studying how to give blowjobs all their lives. You go to a doctor. Do you want Doogie Howser to walk in the room or Marcus Welby? Okay, with doctors, the younger they are, the more up-to-date their methods. But blowjobs? It isn't as if anyone has been dreaming up technological innovations every year. This one guy was in his 70s. After 2 dates, he tells me he really likes me, but he isn't feeling fireworks. Fireworks, I say, seriously? Those fireworks of yours have been lying in a moldy basement for 7 decades. You think maybe the gunpowder might have gotten a little damp? You think maybe you shouldn't expect such a spectacular display? Maybe you should be content with sparklers? Sorry, I don't mean this to be a rant about how older men are all Harvey Weinstein and every woman over 60 is a combination of Helen Mirren, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Betty White, Halle Berry, Meryl Streep, Tina Turner, Sigourney Weaver, Cher, and Maxine Waters, although such a comparison should give you pause. This is about being a woman who grew up in the 1960s and witnessed an earth-shaking change in the way women live their lives, and who now wonders if her expectations weren't a little high, if she might have made a few mistakes, if she might need to overlook a few flaws in a man's behavior if she doesn't want to spend her last 25 years alone. I'll leave it there. So we can do questions now.
Thank you, Eileen. I'm going to invite people. You can either put a question into the chat if you have questions, or you can raise your hand with using the reaction, or if you just need to raise your hand, I'll try to find you on there. But we do, not surprisingly, with this crowd, there were a few questions about the Catskills, and so I'm gonna start with those. Although I will say, your reflection on your elementary school, it feels like, I know we lived a few hours away from each other, but the same Escher-esque type of stairways and everything, it just resonated. I was looking at people's reactions to some of, if you can think back to 3rd and 4th grade, and the discovery of boys and of and the effects of our actions on others. And I actually was thinking about the time that I learned. I was in second grade when I learned the word loquacious. I was told that by a well, apparently my mom takes some credit for expressing this. A friend and I were a childhood friend. Our fathers grew up together. She moved to our elementary school. Our seats were next to each other. And we were sitting next to each other in second grade, and we did not stop talking. And so the teacher separated us. We got into big trouble, which, you know, as nice Jewish girls, we were a little fearful of our parents' reaction. But that's when her father taught us the word loquacious, which apparently my mom, as her Hebrew school teacher, had already written on her report card. So obnoxious and loquacious always have gone hand in hand.
I think obnoxious is worse because it means you're not only talking a lot, you're really setting.
But I think that what I loved is that and you talked about this a little bit at the beginning, that, and it's reflected in the title of the book, perhaps, but how often do we as women ask ourselves those questions? Maybe it's me, and you know, wondering about how our relationships and our relationship with the world and our view and perspective, which can often be different, or we might feel like it's different than everyone else's. And I love the way that even if it doesn't apply to every essay, it was so wonderful to hear your voice actually reading the essay and the essays that you shared with us. So thank you for that. There are a few questions that people asked about the Catskills. That's where I had started before that little interlude. And I know people who are here certainly have that sense of connection. And we've had a couple of books as well that take place in the Catskills. So as someone who's from the Catskills, what was your view of the hotels and guests? And also, what is your thought on the area now?
So it's interesting. I couldn't wait to get away. I was kind of ashamed to be from there. I went directly from the Catskills to Yale, where I thought I was the only Jew because the other Jews were also assimilated, and I had no idea they were Jewish. So it was very odd when I found myself writing about the Catskills. My first couple books are set there, but it's funny because all of us who grew up there, you know, our parents, our grandparents, aunts and uncles, they all owned or worked at the hotels. And the last thing we wanted was to be stuck working at the hotels, running the hotels. They all died anyway. And so many of us who left ended up writing about the places or studying them. I have a friend, Phil Brown, who became a sociology professor, and he studied the Catskills as a sociological phenomenon. I had a foreshadowing, even in the 80s, that one day, long after they were gone, people would be nostalgic for them, which struck all of us as crazy because everybody was ashamed of the Catskills. It was working class Jews, new immigrants who were trying to become American, you know, and these were places known for dirty jokes and, you know, grotesque amounts of food. And so I started writing, first of all, one of my books is set in an era where there's already this nostalgia for the hotels, and there's one hotel remaining that everybody's studying, you know, so that was one of my takes. But I also, as the reality is receded in time, people have become very, very nostalgic for the Jewish community, and wasn't it wonderful? And everybody loved each other, and everybody worked there, and the reality was much, much darker. So often the women did all the work, and they were running the hotels. The men were schmoozing, and you know, the workers worked very hard. There was a big difference between how the Jewish employees and the non-Jewish or Black employees were treated, Hispanic employees. There was a lot of organized crime. So my book, The Bible of Dirty Jokes, is about, it really draws on a lot of my family's, my family's stories about our connections to Murder Incorporated. No, we didn't kill anybody, but pretty much every hotel in the Catskill had some connection to the Jewish mafia. And So there were all these, it was a lot about sex and gambling, and there was just, it was a crazy, it was like growing up in Las Vegas, right? And you can romanticize Las Vegas, but everybody knows there was that darker side. Well, so I tend to write more about the darker underside of the Catskills, which isn't as popular because people just want to be nostalgic. There's nothing left there really in terms of hotels. The place I was telling Sue just before is coming back a tiny bit now, just because it's too far for you to live there and commute to New York City. But if you can work from home remotely, it's perfect, because you could go into the city once or twice a week and be there in 2 hours, and then be back. And you can still buy pretty much any piece of property in Liberty for pocket change. Not much going on there now, but a little bit more. We're a little more optimistic about it, and we're starting. I'm on the board. A number of people are working very hard to start a museum dedicated to the memory of the Jewish Catskills.
Wow. So that was one of the question that goes along with it, about the efforts to revive it. Again, there've been a lot of nostalgic looks. And certainly someone mentioned an effort to potentially bring gambling in as a way to do that. What are your thoughts about that?
So one reason the Catskills died in the 70s and 80s. And just in case you didn't know why they died, I mean, it was because the reasons for their existence didn't pertain anymore. I mean, Jews were not allowed to, check into Christian-run hotels, and in the early and mid 1900s, and they also were not allowed to be patients at tuberculosis sanitariums. So the Jews had to find their own boarding houses, resorts, and sanitaria. So they bought up, so the beautiful Catskills run along the Hudson, but those were owned by Christians, and you couldn't really stay there if you were Jewish or Black or not white. And so the Jews bought up these farms to the west that were not good for farming. And they turned them into boarding houses, bungalow colonies, hotels. My family, my grandfather was one of 12 siblings, and 2 of the sisters got TB. And so all the siblings chipped in their wages from the sweatshops and bought this little farmhouse. And the sisters hated it there. As soon as they were healthy, they went back to New York to find husbands. But my grandfather loved it, and he bought them all out, turned it into a farm and a boarding house and a hotel. I mean, there was no air conditioning in New York City, so you had to get out in the summer, and you couldn't get into regular hotels, and you didn't have the money to go anywhere else. So, by the 80s, though, new generation, our generation, we could check in wherever we wanted. We had more money, and there was air conditioning. So people stopped wanting to go to these kind of not that very fancy hotels with comics they didn't find funny anymore. And all the hotels went bankrupt and closed or were burned down by their owners. So they thought, people only thought of it as a resort area. And they thought, if only we could get gambling legalized, we could be a resort area again. And they just didn't pursue any other industries for, 40 years. They finally got a permit for a casino maybe about 15 years ago. And so there's one casino on the site of the old Concord Hotel, and it barely does any business. And now that they're talking about putting casinos right in Manhattan, that'll kill it altogether. Yeah. So it didn't bring in the boom they were hoping, and that's a false.
So a number of follow-up questions. What you mentioned your grandfather had built a hotel. What hotel was that?
Pollack's Hotel. That's my family name. It's still. We were lucky. We were able to sell ours. A camp for Orthodox Jewish girls, Rebecca Strangler's Camp Gila, and it's still there. Okay. None of the original buildings, but it's on the property.
So, in the chat, someone just mentioned one of the previous books that we've done was with Alyssa Friedland, also through the Jewish Book Council last year. And I don't know if you've read her book, Last Summer at the Golden Hotel, which is sort of about a family that's, you know, owned a
Well,
hotel and.
you know, I have to admit something, you know, writers, if they feel they have a special area of expertise, cannot read other people's books set in that area because either they're jealous or they just keep going, you got it wrong, you got it wrong. So, you know, I have to admit, I've read reviews of her book. I wish her all the best. I can't read
You
it.
can't read it.
She didn't grow up there.
Yeah.
And it's a very different view of it than I have. So, you know, I have Paradise, New York is set there, although it's my first book, it's sort of juvenilia, and Rabbi in the Attic and In the Mouth are all, and the Bible of Dirty Jokes is set there and in Las Vegas. So
As you know, I'm looking forward to reading Rabbi in the Attic. And I just, from what Eileen's shared with me about it, I'm just glad that it was not part of my interview process of the past year plus, but we can all talk about that another time. One of the other questions, Eileen, is whether there was a caste system in the Catskills. For example, was Grossinger's more for the more successful Jews or the most successful Jews, and smaller, less expensive hotels for working class Jews? And was there that split in society, in the Jewish society?
That's a great question. There was the entire gamut from what I'll use the Yiddish because it's nicer, dreck boxes, which were the really drecky places. So they were kocha lanes where it wasn't even a hotel, it wasn't even a bungalow colony, and bungalow colonies and small hotels that were crummy, and nicer small hotels, medium, large, and then the giants, Grossinger's, Concord, Kutcher's, and the Nevele. And with every budget for Jews, every range of social status. So of course, if you were going to Grossinger's or the Concord, you were way higher on the social scale and earned a lot more money than if you were going to a hotel or to some of the really crummy bungalow colonies. And they were nice bungalow colonies. Strangely enough, and not so much among the owners. I never really thought of this before. My grandmother, who was not a nice person. So my grandfather, who started the hotel, was a sweetheart. She was tough as nails, not a nice person. And she would always say, what does Jenny Grossinger have that I don't have? And, you know, why did she end up with Grossinger's and we have this? And we all wanted to say, she was nice, man, and the guests liked her. You're mean. You know, that's why our hotel never prospered. But you know, I went to school with the Grossinger kids. We all went to the same little rinky-dink public high school in Liberty. And, you know, I'm still friends with Elaine Grossinger. Like, what is she, you know, just, we all were in the business, you know, so I'm sure there was some jockeying for position, or maybe the Concord and the Grossingers had some, like, who was the better hotel, but mostly we were all in it together. And you know, if everybody was having a bad season, they were all having a bad season. And it was a lot of status among the Jews, the guests, but not among the workers and the owners. And there were also all sorts of interesting arrangements where if you were staying in a bungalow colony where there was no entertainment, sometimes you had the right to go to the show at the nice hotel nearby. And it was an arrangement, you know, and you could buy dinner there and see the show. And so, you know, so.
Nice. We have a question from the group. Robin.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi.
Hi, Eileen. 30 years ago, you were my creative writing teacher at Tufts. And
Oh my God.
I like went crazy because I've
wait, who is this?
Robin Miller.
Oh, Robin. Oh my goodness. I can't remember what you wrote for me, but I remember that you were my student.
Well, I remember you
30 years. It was 1985.
No, it wasn't that. You were there again, I guess, a little later. I was there 91 to
91, right. I came back. That's right.
Yes, and I remember your son, little curly haired, kind of playing in the classroom. But anyway, I just remember you so very fondly. And as I read this book sort of in a lightning fast over the weekend, and really loved it and loved learning about you, but also sort of remembering I've always I've continued to write, but not publicly much and at all. And I was sort of remembering some of your tips around writing, asking lots of questions, kind of what's going on in their head. And I remember really bonding with you over the sort of presence of the Jewish family and history and culture, and the conflict between what does it mean to be a Jew and what kind of Jew, and just the family relationships. And I came from a family business, and so just so many layers that I remember bonding with you back then about. And as I was reading this book, I guess my question is, about your courage in sort of exposing yourself and your thinking and your ambivalence and your, the good parts and the parts that most of us sort of, keep to ourselves to not be judged. And I really just admire that and wish I had that courage. I'm a psychologist now, so I listen to people's stories, but I have not really had the courage to sort of say, all that you say. And so I just kind of put that out there to you.
Well, I'm really touched that you're here and that you remember and that you thought it was worthwhile. And I love hearing that you still write. Courage, I don't know, to me, it's like somebody goes out and sings on a stage is exhibiting courage, because I can, read my stuff, most personal stuff, and I'm not nervous, I don't feel, but if you ask me, and there's an essay in here about this, if you ask me to sing 2 bars of a song, I'm going to just fall apart. I don't have the courage to do that in front of an audience, right? So it kind of comes with the territory, when people are in my writing classes and they say, well, I'm scared to say this, to write this, or what if somebody reads this? I kind of say that's the whole, it's like saying I want to work construction, but I'm afraid of heights, or I want to be a marine biologist, but I'm scared of water. It comes with the calling. My sister cannot bear to read my stuff. She's not only embarrassed that I reveal stuff about the family, but how can I say these things and then face anybody? She's embarrassed for me. My mother only ever heard me read once. She came, I gave a reading in Boca Raton where she and my father lived. They opened a Borders there, and she sat in the first row like this, with her head in her hands like this. I said later, Mom, do you think nobody saw you? Were you ashamed of me? Did I embarrass you? She said, no, but I was afraid you would, whereas my father didn't care. So it's a very, it's just, to me, it's like, this is what you do. And somebody has to tell the truth. I happen to be, I guess I elected myself.
Love it. And I wondered if you had to wait for them to die before
My mother, yes, I had to wait for my mother to die to write. If you look at my early fiction, my essays, there's nothing about mothers, because she couldn't, even if it had nothing to do with her, it was not based on her in the slightest. If it was a mother, she thought it was her, and she couldn't take it. So I didn't. My father literally gave me carte blanche, write whatever you want. He loved it. And he had this defense mechanism. He once told my cousin, there's something called artistic license. She's making it, if it was something he didn't want to believe about me, he just said, I was making it up.
Thank you so much. I have to step off, but I'm going to reach out to you by email and see if we could connect.
Robin, I can help. I'm happy to connect you, and so glad. What a wonderful insight, and just added such a nice piece of this. So thank you. I'm glad that you were with us.
Thanks.
So 2 additional just final questions. One is there was a question about when the Museum of the Catskills is set to open, if you know when that's set to open.
So it's going to be in Ellenville. They've actually bought the building. There's going to be a temporary, some kind of exhibit there, I think maybe next summer, but I don't think the full museum's going to be up and running for maybe, another, maybe 2 years. I think it's going to probably take, but it stalled for a long time, and now there's a new group running it. They bought consultants, we've had meetings, and now I really think it's going to happen. And it's interesting because Some of the people were kind of wanted it to just be this kind of schmaltzy, like I said, nostalgic thing. And then there are other people who are real, to say academics and museum people, who said there's a difference between a tourist attraction and a museum. And we want people to actually learn something from coming about Jewish culture, history. And so I'm happy to say I think it's going to go in the right direction and be an actual museum rather than just a, surface kind of, Jews in the Catskills.
Well, we might have to plan a Women of Washington Hebrew or a Washington Hebrew trip to visit. Well, I do see there's one, I don't know if you saw this in the chat. Michael Dine wrote that he's currently reading The Only Woman in the Room, who was a grad student at Yale at that time, and your perspectives on the people, the profession are quite eye-opening for him.
Thank you.
So last question, Eileen, what are you working on now? Are you still writing every day, or how often are you writing? And what can we look forward to?
Well, yeah, I am writing. So I have three projects going on now. I'll just give very brief. I have a story called The Bris that actually Stephen King had chosen for Best American Stories a while back, and I adapted that into a play. So I thought maybe that'll show up sometime in a theater near you. I'm working on a short story about I dated Santa Claus, a guy who played the Santa Claus at Radio City Music Hall and in the Coca-Cola commercials and stuff. So it's a short story about a Jew dating Santa Claus. And I'm working on a novel that takes place the summer of 1974, which was the summer of my senior year in high school. And it's sort of, I just got annoyed that on Facebook, the group from my hometown was just always going on about, oh, in those days, everybody was happy and there was no child abuse and no, violence or racism or anti-Semitism, which I don't know what town they were living in. It was not the town I was living in. So it's looking back sort of with, there were some relationships I had with older men, teachers and bosses that I viewed in one way when I was 16, 17, 18, and that I view a very different way now. Relationships with some of the people of color in town, and a lot of the violence against women that was going on in the town that, again, it's how we saw things when we were young, and how, looking back, I think many of us who are our age now see those same events through a much different lens. And I guess, I love nostalgia. I'm prone to it. And so I'm kind of writing out of that, trying to recapture a certain time and a place. But I really get upset when people use it to cover up what's been there all along. And, I guess the whole Make America Great Again, returning us to some mythic time when there was no child abuse or homosexuality or racism or anti-Semitism, that time did not exist. In fact, times were much worse than, I think, in many ways, not always, not so many mass killings. Anyway, those are the projects I'm working on now.
We'll look forward to reading. I know not just the Rabbi in the Attic. That's for me personally. I'm excited and intrigued. And I know that Eileen, these essays really were a wonderful reflection on things that you've experienced, but also so resonant for so many of us, and insights that you shared. And again, hearing it in your voice was so wonderful, and sharing that perspective. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. As I said, it's been really nice to spend time with you. So I wish you all a happy Hanukkah and very good New Year.
Thank you. You as well.